Great. Thank you, Amy.
So Whitney, are you going to introduce the whole thing and
Yes.
introduce Asia, or is Asia introducing herself?
No, Aisha typed up this nice introduction for her, so I'm going to read it.
Great.
Did you want to address the group too?
No.
No.
Do you, Zach, do you want to announce our working group as a thing? Tell about other projects we're working on? That might be good.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Well, I guess maybe the big thing in line with what Amy was saying is we have a working group here at Washington. We do a lot of internal presentations, but if anybody ever wanted to talk to us, we'd be really excited to have you. And I think another just thing is I'm going to be teaching a class on homelessness, focusing on Seattle in the winter. So if anybody wants to volunteer to speak in my class, probably be 60 to 100 undergrads, that would be amazing.
Asia just volunteered.
I'm already prepared.
Right?
Thank you, Zach. Hi, everybody. We're going to wait a couple more minutes, and then we'll get moving. We are recording today's session so that people who can't attend can watch it after.
I'm going to run and get something. I'll be right back. So it's 6 minutes past the half hour. You want to start, Whitney?
Yeah, yeah, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Whitney. I manage the data systems for the REACH program. Typically, Chloe is a facilitator of the policy forum. She asked that I lead this session because of my connection with the guests and because she's out of town. So hopefully this is where you want to find yourself today, and we're excited that you're here. We're joined today from a team of researchers that REACH has been collaborating with for the last couple of years. We're joined by Dr. Amy Hagopian from the UW, Dr. Zach Almquist from the UW, and Asia, you have your PhD, so Dr. Asia Marie Sutton as well. Asia Sutton will be our primary presenter today on her work with using REACH's encampment, location and encampment information. Asia is a postdoctoral scholar at the Stanford Dewar School of Sustainability at Stanford University. She received her PhD in geography at the University of Washington, where she continues to collaborate with Dr. Zach Almquist and Dr. Amy Hagopian. Her research focuses on the social ecology of human health using computational social science tools like survey science, Bayesian statistics, and spatial methods. And I did ask her for a little blurb about herself. So in her spare time, she likes to cook with her partner, Tom, read fiction, and knit. Thank you, Asia, for joining us today. Asia will be presenting for about a half an hour, and then hopefully also join us for some Q&A. So as you're listening to the work, be thinking about some questions you'd like to ask this team of researchers. You feeling ready, Asia?
Yep.
Great. Handing it over to you.
Thank you. And thanks for having me, Amy, and Zach here today to share what we've been up to with the help of Whitney to look at some of the REACH data. So let me just share my slides because I think it's always helpful to have a visual. Okay. Can we get it to actually go full screen? Let's see. That should, there we go. Okay. So what I'm presenting today focuses on a couple of themes. We're going to think about amenities, which I'll explain what that is if you're not familiar with this term, environmental hazards, and general kind of neighborhood stressors among people living outdoors in Seattle. When I say neighborhood stressors, this really just means things that you might be exposed to in the place that you live as a characteristic of the place itself, kind of physically, say. So let's get going. So the UN's 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights names housing as a necessity for human life. I don't think that's surprising to anybody that we all need housing. However, in the US, no jurisdiction actually guarantees the condition for producing health, including housing, even though the homelessness crisis across the country is intensifying. So people living outdoors have scant protection from weather and other environmental hazards. So we're going to think about environmental hazards a lot today because we can measure these. In King County, which is the 8th largest county by population size in the US, we also have the 3rd largest population of unhoused people in the country, half of whom are still unsheltered from our estimates. So obviously this is a really prescient problem in this area, but again, I don't need to tell you that because of the work that ETS and REACH does. So I guess the caveat through this is that I'm going to tell you a lot of things that I don't think are going to necessarily surprise you. And because I think that really I'm talking to a room full of people who are experts in this in some way or other, or at least have really intensive intuition about this. So I'm just going to like make sure we're all on the same page with this talk more than anything. So living outside without recourse to stable shelter is really harmful to human health. Compared to the house population in this country, people experiencing chronic homelessness experience significantly greater all-cause mortality, so all causes of death, suicide and homicide rates, risk of morbidities, which are just illnesses that can lead to premature death. They have a greater risk of cardiovascular and respiratory disease because they're being exposed to automotive and industrial emissions at a greater rate, typically. They have the risk of long-term exposure to various health stressors, so things that can cause ill health related to living outside. Not to mention the incredible chronic stress, depression, and sleep disruption from living outside. They've got a greater risk of being targeted by the judicial system. They have greater risk of exposure to infectious disease because of conjugate living situations. They experience greater incarceration rates than the house population. They have a greater risk of inadequate access to medical care for chronic illness like heart disease, cancer, and diabetes, and are generally at risk for mental health. We know that when encampments are dispersed or swept, which I know is not the term that REACH prefers, but it is the term that shows up in the academic literature, so I may use it. Occupants of encampments are often disconnected from their personal social networks. They lose their property, and they're often no longer able to connect with social workers and support systems. But I don't think that that is necessarily surprising for this room. It is, however, something that the academic discourse and people outside of specialist rooms like this aren't aware of or don't think about. And so this work is not only speaking to the data that you have provided through REACH and kind of giving you an update on how we've kind of all jigsawed it together into like a picture of what's going on in Seattle, but we're also writing a paper or a series of papers to kind of speak to the greater discourse and try to share our knowledge beyond the Seattle area. So with that, we know that forced displacement negatively affects the health of the unhoused. So there are barriers to access for amenities, and there are circumstances for exposures to disamenities. And I'll explain what those mean in a second. But essentially, societal hostility towards homelessness is pretty high, and probably anecdotally, we haven't measured this, is increasing. So there's a lot of not in my backyard NIMBY attitudes towards the homelessness crisis, which have existed since the process of urban renewal began in the post-war period. After the Second World War, there was a lot of urban abandonment and decay. Everybody moved to the suburbs, or it felt like everybody did anyway. Suburban sentiments around safety and aesthetics and gentrifying urban environments may contribute to hostility towards physical poverty and homelessness. Like in many large cities in the US, and I'm going to point to San Francisco a couple times because I think it's a good example, visible homelessness in Seattle has led to the rise of complaint-oriented services and policing of homelessness. I'm going to talk about a bit about this, but these terms are from a scholar named Chris Herring, whose academic work focuses on these areas and on homelessness generally in the US and especially on the West Coast. So Chris Herring theorizes, and we find evidence somewhat in our work, which I'll get to, of complaint-oriented policing, which is the deployment of law enforcement to address individuals living in invisible poverty. And he also theorizes this thing called complaint-oriented services, which is, there are lots of things that could fall under this umbrella, but one example is the formal shelter systems, where, like it or not, in some cases, law enforcement may use the offer of shelter beds as tools to legally punish people living outside under the guise of public health and sanitation initiatives, including removing their property. So there's this tension between help and also the tension between help and also punishment for being visibly poor in the wrong places. So complaint-oriented policing and services are motivated by collecting and responding to formal complaints from the general housed public. But the important thing that I think you need to think about when we think about complaints is that complaint volume may not be correlated with the number of visibly homeless people outside. It's more about perception. So for example, in San Francisco from 2013 to 2017, while the unsheltered population remained stable through this period, the volume of complaints to police regarding homeless concerns increased by 72%. So there is, across the US in big cities, significant pressure on law enforcement and other public services to address the homelessness crisis, often with inappropriate or inadequate tools. So regardless of real visible homelessness presence, if provided a formal system through which to participate in policing, public attitudes towards and perceptions of homelessness can have significant effects on the lived experiences of people living outside. So what I mean by when I say tools for policing or like complaints, I'm thinking about LA's 311 and the Find It, Fix It app or Seattle's city service requests. And so we're going to look a little bit at those two in relation to the REACH data. I know it's a little spicy, but bear with me. So I want to think a little bit about criminalization of homelessness survival strategies, especially in the wake of Grants Pass. The US has slowly been shifting attitudes about homelessness from societal failure to societal anathema for decades. So in the response to the significant increase in homelessness in the wake of the dissolution of Jim Crow and vagrancy laws in the 80s, US cities began rolling out municipal codes and policies, making unsheltered survival strategies like camping and sleeping in parks, sitting on public sidewalks, and panhandling severely restricted or functionally illegal. Policy trends have been on the rise for over 40 years, but these have accelerated rapidly since 2016. In 2019, a survey of 187 US cities found that a large percent had at least one law restricting public camping, sleeping, begging, sleeping in vehicles, scavenging or dumpster diving, if you will, loitering and vagrancy, property storage and urination and defecation. So in many cities, it is increasingly difficult to survive while living outdoors in public spaces without encountering punitive measures. Meanwhile, so we have this context of like, this is what's going on in the policy world, and this is what's going on where there's like a lot of societal policing going on, right? But I think the other thing that's going on that's kind of even above this, kind of affecting everything, is that private enterprise is fanning the flames of vagrancy laws and criminalization of homelessness. So there are private organizations involved in promoting punitive measures to capitalize on poverty and homelessness. An example is the Cicero Institute. So the Cicero Institute, if you haven't heard of it, is a venture capital enterprise and lobbyist group focused on the privatization and monetization of the carceral system. And it was founded by the same billionaire who founded Palantir Technologies. If you're unfamiliar with Palantir Technologies, I won't dwell on it. Suffice to say, they have been accused of human rights violations, both domestically and internationally before their technologies, and you can look them up on Wikipedia. So the Cicero Institute is actively contributing to the industrialization of the criminalization of homelessness by targeting representatives in municipal and state legislatures and offering a punitive privatization template to encourage short-term carceral consequences for publicly visible homelessness for private financial gain. And these trends are absolutely relentless. So homelessness criminalization legislation using this CISRO template has been passed at the state level in Texas, Utah, Georgia, Tennessee, and Missouri, though it was passed illegally there in Missouri and struck down last year. It's actively being discussed and or reintroduced in legislatures in Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, Iowa, Wisconsin, Arizona, and California. Locally, we have something that isn't from the Cicero Institute, but is in the same kind of vein. Right now, we have Bill SB 5332, which was recently reintroduced after being rejected last year. It aims to prohibit locating homelessness encampments near schools and early learning facilities and proposes a 1,000-foot exclusion area around each location. If you carefully read it, it specifies early learning facilities as inclusive of family daycare providers. And if you very carefully look at what a family daycare provider is in the state of Washington, it's a childcare provider who regularly provides early childhood education and early learning services for not more than 12 children at any given time in the provider's home in the family living quarters. So a broad reasonable interpretation of this is that camping in proximity to any domicile would potentially be legally punishable, including through the removal of camps. So this risk is greatly heightened in increasingly densely populated urban areas like Seattle, but remember, this is a state level proposal. So this would allow move along policing of encampments and a lot more displacement in Seattle. And I don't need to tell you that people living outside would consequently experience greater disruption to their lives, access to amenities and services, fewer options for self-government shelter, and greater exposure to disamenities like environmental risks associated with non-residential areas. So, to quote Chris Herring, each law taken on its own may seem limited in its strictures on targeted behaviors, but collectively they effectively criminalize homelessness. This legislation and legislation like it seems designed to make way for a new wave of vagrancy laws in America. And I wrote this statement even before Grants Pass went the way it did. So like, this is happening. So we obviously need policy solutions and resources. Unsheltered people survive in precarious dynamic conditions characterized and shaped by frequent displacement. And intense and emotional disruptions to daily life make it extremely difficult to provide unsheltered people with support or gather and analyze information relating to their needs and environmental changes. So we really, really need innovative region-specific data resources. And fortunately, REACH was able to provide your data with the three of us, and we've done an analysis to this end. So what did we do? We conducted a temporal, so time and spatial analysis of the relationship between encampment locations and proximity to amenities and disamenities across Seattle from 2016 to 2022. We used the REACH data and also used Washington State Department of Health data from the city of Seattle pertaining to zoning amenities and the city service requests. And we also included some socio-demographic characteristics, so like what the people are like in the different neighborhoods or different census tracts from the census. And essentially, we put all this data in a pile and we analyzed encampment distribution from the REACH data as neighborhood socioeconomic contexts and environmental risk. So I know I've been promising a description of what an amenity and a disamenity is. Here we are. So an amenity, amenities are benefits or positive characteristics like access to grocery options, like being able to walk to the grocery store, or being really close to public transit, that kind of thing. And a disamenity is some drawback or negative characteristic. So exposure to health risks, for example, or lack of access to transit associated with a particular location. So at the area level, we may also call these neighborhood stressors. There's the link to the title. We're going to talk about the entire area of Seattle. I guess the thing I want to think about with you here is that Seattle is very, very long, and it's obviously divided by a lot of bodies of water. And there are many, many ways to cut up a city like Seattle kind of spatially. So one way we're going to look at Seattle is at the kind of big neighborhood level. So I'll stick this map in our neighborhood analyses just so that you always have a sense of where these places are, even if you don't necessarily or like you don't intuitively know where Lake City is because you live in the South, or you don't actually understand the delineations of Beacon Hill. So it'll always be there. But the other geographic way of breaking up the city is census tracts, and census tracts are kind of arbitrary lines across according to like housing, and it just captures 10,000 people at a time. So that's all you need to know. So the amenities and disamenities across the city have kind of an uneven distribution. And so these are some of the amenities. I know it's not clear, but what I want you to take from this is that all the little dots, all of the different amenities we've measured, including grocery stores, warehouses, bus stops, etc. We'll get into that. But what I really want you to focus on in this map is that over all time, we have taken the point locations of the encampments, and I've created what I like to think of as a heat map. So the purple kind of big blob on the outside of like the color rings says that there are encampments there, but it's at a lower density than kind of towards the center, which is yellow-green. So overall time, encampments are focused downtown. And that's not surprising, but when we start breaking things up a little bit, and with respect to time, there are different trends. So first thing I want to think about with you is, because we're thinking about environmental exposure, we're probably also going to be thinking about where people are camping with respect to city zoning. So we have here on the left a kind of ribbon plot, and on the bottom we see we have year. And so as the year progresses from left to right, that's time. And on the y-axis, so I'm going up, we have the proportion of encampments. So we're looking at the proportion of encampments by city zoning type over time. On the right-hand side, we have the zoning description, which is given to us by the city. And what I guess I want you to focus on mostly is that we have commercial, downtown, which is different than all others, industrial, and then a bunch of different neighborhood and residential and mixed zoning. Over time, about half of all encampments were located in commercial, downtown, and industrial areas, and the rest were located in neighborhood and residential areas. And this has been more or less stable across time. There is a little like bump up in 2019 in the middle of the plot, but I'll talk about this a little bit more later and I'll remind you, but what's really going on here, I think, is that the social workers who were collecting data weren't collecting data using the digital tool that they're provided with at this time, from what I understand. And so that uptrend mostly is an artifact of very little data at the time. So it really pulls in one direction. When we look at individual encampments over time versus distance to various things that people might want access to, we see some interesting trends. So on the left-hand side, we have at the bottom individual encampments. And so each little dot is a different encampment. And we've measured the distance from, if we look at the very, very top of the plot, metro bus stops to encampments. So it's the closest metro bus stop from that encampment. And what we're trying to do here is understand the different places that might be important for selecting an encampment, or the different places that might be just as part of being shuffled around the city where you end up eventually. And what it seems to me like, again, looking at the left-hand plot, encampments are located most closely to metro bus stops, vacant lots, parks, warehouses, and parking lots, but also they're really located quite closely to grocery stores. After this, on the right-hand side, things become a little bit more dispersed. And so it's anyone's guess the importance of these locations, but we can definitely say that based on the number of metro bus stops, vacant lots, parks, etc., these kinds of locations seem important, at least spatially, to encampment locations and where people are choosing to camp or must camp. When we look at demographics, we will first look at the racial composition of census tracts in Seattle across time. And I realize this is quite small, but I'll give you a brief description of what's going on here, and then we'll like focus on two. So it'll get bigger, I promise. So we have from 2016 through to 2022, and then I've also thrown in the encampments for which we have no year given because I think they're still valuable as a data point. What I've done is I've taken the values for these different race ethnicity categories. And if the race ethnicity category in the geographic area is greater or equal to 30% of the population, I've colored it in. And if it's smaller than that, I've left it white, which is why you see certain dots in places and certain colors in places, but like lots white in Asian, non-Hispanic, Black, non-Hispanic, and Hispanic. The city of Seattle is overwhelmingly white, as evidenced by the bottom line. So what I'm seeing here, and obviously this is subject to interpretation from a researcher's perspective, and I'd love some feedback on this. But over time, for the most part, encampments have been located in overwhelmingly white neighborhoods. There are very few neighborhoods that are not, that have a large proportion of people who are not white, for lack of a better term. And that the encampments that Reach has served are not in places with high proportions of Black, non-Hispanic folks and Hispanic folks. There are, however, a couple cases up in the Asian section of the plot, the Asian non-Hispanic section, where there are absolutely services being provided by Reach in these neighborhoods. So if we make them a little bit bigger, the red dots that you see are kind of like the greatest number of encampments, and the yellow dots are the smallest number of encampments. So it's kind of cut up between like 10, 20, 30 over each year. And we see that more or less the dots are kind of like centering around SoDo, I would say, right? Based on that red dot here. Let me see. Can you see my mouse? Here. So I would not say that there's a huge racial composition trend going on, but I would say that it is interesting that the neighborhoods in which a large proportion of the population is Asian, non-Hispanic have not had a lot of Reach services, and I don't know what's going on at the city level for that. When we look at socioeconomic characteristics, particularly the median household income, we see that essentially as the median household income stays fairly low, so do you see the kind of teal scale at the bottom left-hand corner? There are just more encampments generally. But I think that this is more starkly obvious, this narrative is more starkly obvious when we look at poverty level and unaffordable housing. So poverty level here is a federal consideration or definition wherein it's households living in less than or equal to 185% of the federal poverty level, so really quite poor. And if you look at it, you see that, let me back up. In this map, Black is really, really high poverty. Yellow is quite low poverty. So it's a sliding scale. And if you look at the area around SoDo and the area around South Seattle, there is a much higher proportion or a much higher tendency towards poverty in these areas. And there are also a lot of encampments. Similarly, if you look at unaffordable housing across the city, the trends are somewhat slightly different because unaffordable housing is just a measure of like how unaffordable it is for you to live in your place of residence. And are you paying greater than 30% of your overall income into your housing? So like, that's a different way to look at people's overall like financial well-being. So I think what I want you to take away from this slide is that essentially there are more encampments, or at least more outreach in places where people are feeling greater socioeconomic stress across time. And this is pretty stable. If we think about environmental risks, this is a quite stark example of a very clear narrative. So this is a map of proximity to automotive traffic where black is very high and that kind of peachy color is really, really low. So it's essentially the shape of I-5 all the way up through the city, but not just that. We see that, again, encampments are located in places with really high automotive traffic. And this is consistent over time. With respect to Superfund sites, and if you're not familiar with Superfund sites, when the EPA was founded, they had to classify sites that were going to take special care to be cleaned up in a specific way. And so they deem these Superfund sites, and they are provided with extra funds to do this. But it essentially means that it's environmentally quite hazardous to be in proximity of these places. Seattle has a lot of Superfund sites, especially in the south of Seattle. The entire basin of the Duwamish River is a big Superfund site because of unmitigated industrial processes in the 20th century. So if you were living in a house in these places, you're not as readily exposed to these risks because you're not constantly touching the soil. But if you live in an encampment, you're much more likely to touch the soil of somewhere that's close to a Superfund site, and you're more likely to be exposed to this health risk. And we see that this glowing green dot in the middle of the black, that's Soto area again, but even kind of stretching downward along the Duwamish, the way that the Duwamish curves, there are just a lot of encampments there. So it's extremely hazardous to camp here, and there are a lot of camps. When we look at proximity to toxic air release, which is being near a stack related with an industrial process that gives out some sort of toxic air release, we see that again, these trends are very similar to Superfund sites. Encampments are in places that are extremely environmentally hazardous and often appear to be either like downtown or really close to industry. And this is more or less intensifying over time. So taken together, the exposure to environmental risks in the city, if you're living outside based on the REACH data, is intensifying over time. It's always been high, but it's getting higher. And if you are a nerd like me and like spatial statistics, I ran a quick spatial model looking at the way that encampments cluster relative to these risks that I've just talked about, and pretty much consistently the greatest signal, like the greatest risk that we can reliably estimate is proximity to automotive traffic, though there's an argument to be said that there's a connection to median household income and also proximity to Superfund sites in particular. And everything else is up to interpretation, and probably we need more information on it. But the trends seem mostly positive. Why don't we like switch now to thinking about Seattle service requests and encampments. So here on the right bottom, we have our neighborhood map again. The three categories that we looked at for this analysis are abandoned vehicle, illegal dumping of needles, and unauthorized encampment. And on this map, in case you're unfamiliar with these, if there is a white space, it's because that category that we're looking at didn't exist until the year it actually starts being colored in. I want to point out the teal bar on the right-hand side, which is just the number of complaints. And so there are places on this map where there are like 350 complaints a year. So I want to caveat this with the fact that that could just be somebody calling every day, all day. Or it could be many people calling and amounting to 350 some odd complaints. We cannot disentangle this, but what we can say is that more or less complaints about illegal dumping in needles have been consistent across time and seem to have intensified through the period of the pandemic. We see that abandoned vehicle complaints in 2022 especially were extremely high across the city, but in particular in the Northwest and in the central area. And of course, also in the greater Duwamish and Delridge area. And so it's definitely where you see a lot of encampments, except in the Northwest, where Reach has very few encampments that they interact with. With respect to unauthorized encampment complaints, there weren't that many relative to other types of complaints, but I think this might actually just be an artifact of the fact that it was a new category. It didn't exist all the way through 2022. And if we were to look at more recent data, I would imagine that there would be more complaints based on these other trends. So this is a map of SB 5332's proposed exclusion areas. And also I've thrown in this little teal kind of blob throughout to show you where the industrial zones are, just to give you a sense of what's going on with the layout of the city. In a nutshell, if you were camping in Seattle and you were trying to avoid these exclusion zones, the smallest area between these red blobs, these exclusion zones, is 7 meters wide. So you would have to be threading the needle really carefully in a lot of parts of the city. It's pretty untenable. It's definitely emphasizing that people would be pushed either along the shoreline or into industrial areas. So this is an environmental catastrophe in the making, potentially, and with respect to environmental health of people living outside. So just to conclude, encampment locations have increased in number, at least insofar as Reach's response volumes have increased. They appear to concentrate mostly in Seattle's low-income residential, downtown, and industrial areas. Disproportionately harmful environmental exposures, including industrial areas with greater automotive traffic, presence of Superfund sites, and toxic air release from industrial practices, are environmental health risks that people living outside experience more or less every day. And the greater length of exposure only increases their health risk. We know that high volumes of complaints exist both in industrial areas with high numbers of encampments and in wealthy neighborhoods with few encampments recorded. And I would love a little bit more help with interpreting that from Reach, because my interpretation, understanding that Reach's data is not a perfect sample of the homeless population living outside, is that I think that this is evidence of community or complaint-oriented policing. So the city service requests appear to be creating a system of neighborhood churn and concentration of encampments in dangerous places. And I understand that city services service requests are not necessarily linked to Reach being deployed by the city, but I think that the city is definitely looking at these requests and making decisions based on that. Anyway, so that's all I have for today. I know it was a lot. If you would like me to revisit any of the slides, I'm more than happy to do so. And I am really thankful that you share this time with me, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Asia. Thank you, team. And of course, a shout out to our outreach service providers who really creating this data that are allowing us to do this research. Well, I want to dive into some questions. I had a couple to kick us off, and then Ivana put one in the chat. Feel free to either use the chat or raise your hand, and I'll try to get through everybody. We have about 15 minutes left. So thank you for kicking us off, Asia, with the kind of the deep context and the history of our work. I think there was a lot there that I didn't know, and so it was nice to have that shared, even though we're experiencing this through our work. The greater context is affecting it. But just in general, what was something about this research that surprised you, that you were anticipating finding?
I honestly didn't think about, so like my background isn't related to this area at all, to be clear. But so I didn't necessarily expect there to be such a close connection to like bus stops, but I think it might be an artifact of people having to choose to live in public spaces, and public spaces are often streets. And so that, you know, it passes the sniff test. It tracks. I just didn't expect it at all. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think that kind of a lot of this stuff we see when we're analyzing the data is that people are living in the margins, right? So when you draw a line dividing a neighborhood, you draw it down a major road. And so what side of that do our clients land on, or these encampments land on, to be grouped in with these neighborhoods? And yeah, it didn't particularly surprise us seeing that these things were close to libraries. I was shocked to see how the that they weren't particularly aligned with the locations of food banks. I thought that there might be more congregation around those locations, thinking about the Georgetown, Rainier Beach, and First Hill food banks. And then, you know, thinking about why is this important to us? Why do we, what can we carry away with this? So what do you think is the greatest impact for our work, or kind of in general of these findings?
So like on a day-to-day basis, you know best, but I think when speaking in policy contexts, the environmental health stress that people living outside are experiencing is immense. I think with these kinds of maps that we produced, it's easy to just say, well, everybody is exposed to these things on a daily basis, and so like what's the difference really? But I think the environmental exposures are heightened by living outside, and that's just like, you can't argue with that. Living in a hermetically sealed home is very different in Georgetown than living on the sidewalk. And I think thinking about not just the acute conditions that people can develop because of exposures like respiratory issues, but also the long-term effects of being exposed to these health stressors, which can lead to cardiovascular disease, you know, food insecurity and only buying your food from like the convenience stores, say, can lead to higher rates of diabetes and other kind of, you know, obesity and those kinds of really big chronic conditions. Furthermore, exposure to like Superfund sites has been shown to increase incidence of cancers. I think that it's an environmental injustice, not just it's a human rights failure to let people live outside. And I think that when you're arguing for your funding and like funding for getting people into housing, that's the biggest takeaway. But on a day-to-day basis, you're the experts.
Thank you, Asia. A couple of things on that. I think I think on the ground, or when we're talking with partners, you know, oftentimes somebody's chronic health condition is either attributed to their genetic predisposition or personal choices, like you know, substance use or smoking. And I think working to include these environmental factors into that conversation would be really helpful. I agree. And then second, I'm not sure if anyone here really knows the answer to this, and I'm looking mostly at Karen and Joel on this, but when we think about, you said there were two phenomena. There was the complaint-based policing, and what was the second one? The kind of displacing people and saying that it was for their own health, for their own good.
Oh yeah, complaint oriented policy and like resources.
Complaint-oriented policy, yeah. So when we look at this and we say, okay, well, this encampment is on a Superfund site, and you know, and also has, you know, higher air pollution, and when, you know, the city, how do we work with the city? This is a little bit of rhetorical, but how do we work with these governments that then start using these these factors to essentially reinforce their motivation to displace people? And so I feel like there's a little bit of a double-edged sword there. So that, yes, we want people to move inside, but then it also creates more reasons to be moving people along, likely into areas that are even more unsafe. So I don't know if anybody else wanted to speak to that. I know that your research doesn't necessarily help us answer how do we do that, but thank you.
Did you want me to answer?
I think I'm curious if it feels relevant to this topic.
I mean, it is, because like I think that's, like you're saying, the double-edged sword, right, of policy in general, but public health policy. It's like, what public health are we looking at? And I think that that's where we can drive the conversation that public health includes our clients. It shouldn't be used against them. But I don't know that, yeah, it is used. Currently, parks do use that scoring guideline to be like, this is unsafe and dangerous because there's fentanyl smoke. But we know that if our clients are using fentanyl, there's going to be fentanyl smoke wherever they are. So we want to acknowledge the impacts of, you know, harmful parts of substance use, and also not demonize substance use or demonize these things. And I think that that's where policy is a structure. Policy is something we can kind of fall back on to implement the social changes that we want. But with policy formation, it does require that social change, that the way that the policy is going to be used, implemented, and enforced align with the overall goal of that policy, which is to protect our community. So it's a double task. It's how should this policy look to accurately and adequately support the people that are going to be impacted by how this policy is implemented, and also have enough protections and accountability in place that the way that that policy is used is not to be detrimental to marginalized populations.
Thank you, Karen.
I have a thought to speak to all of this, if I may.
Please.
Yeah, so part of the research that we're doing is thinking, and I like touch on it a little bit in this talk, but there's like so much information to share that I didn't really get into it. We've been thinking about neighborhood churn, and when I say neighborhood churn, I mean like there's already theory and evidence to suggest that when you displace people, they kind of stay local, and if you do it frequently, then they end up localizing in places that are, like, frankly, increasingly hazardous because they're places that are liminal. And if you're not familiar with liminality, it's like an academic concept, but it's essentially the places between places, undesirable places that people walk through. So like that might theoretically explain why somebody would want to camp below I-5, and it's because they're less likely to be disturbed and they're more likely to have privacy. No one's claiming to live under I-5 except the people who are living under I-5, right? Like, so like you're not going to have the same kind of encounters as in parks, say, with the house population. But I think that part of the way of addressing this like disconnect between producing this kind of research and then trying to convince policymakers and governments to actually use it for good instead of use it to kind of conveniently sweep people away, is to continue to gather data really aggressively to gather more evidence to suggest that their policies are just concentrating people in harmful places, even if they move them. Because eventually, like, something's got to give. If there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it, like, housing first works, and we know that it does, right? Then like that breaks down that response. I mean, obviously they don't have to listen to any of us, but it's kind of an unimpeachable truth.
Thank you, Asia.
Oh, I guess the other thing I had to say is that in our work, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that even though there are really high encampment counts in places that are low income or under really high socioeconomic stress, there aren't a lot of complaints. And so I think thinking about where pressures are coming from inside the city, and especially with respect to like the Seattle City Council districts, might be a helpful angle, especially over time, and especially in this period of time that we're living through where things are becoming more expensive and affordability is in real crisis.
Right. Question in the chat from Ivana. Ivana, do you want me to just read this? Great. So in looking at the amenities, when you had them located on the map, and then overlaid that with the heat map of the encampment locations, Ivana was also curious, are the amenities also located where the white people are? Did you do that research?
Yeah, so like insofar as the city of Seattle is overwhelmingly white, like yes, but there are amenities across the city. It's fairly distributed. I would say that the south of the city is less well served than the north of the city, but this is being remedied. I would say that there are food deserts and transit deserts that exist, especially like South Beacon Hill area, where increasing numbers of encampments have been identified by REACH in the recent years. But I wouldn't say that it is Seattle is a city that is so overwhelmingly white as a majority that it's pretty hard to say that like people of color are being underserved in their communities, except in the South. And then I think you can make an argument.
Thank you,
That's what I was
Asia.
wondering. That was something that back in the day I want to identify how far when I was in school of public health we identified. So I was wondering.
Yeah.
How it looks today.
Yeah. I think it's improved, but it's still wildly imperfect, and there's only room for improvement. Thank you.
Any other questions for the last couple of minutes? Thoughts?
Wild, crazy proposals for future research. What do you want to know?
One thing I'm wondering about, so I'm on the outreach team, our contracts and kind of styles of work that we've done have changed over the course of these times. So we were exclusively tied to the city from 2016 to 2019-ish. 2019 through 2021 was kind of some gaps of different styles of outreach as we dealt with pandemics and moving away from the city. We moved into a more regional model. I don't know how to make this into a question. I wonder, like, when I see those kind of changes in your data, I don't know, like Whitney, have we thought about how have reaches changes internally been accounted for in seeing, like, if we're looking and drawing conclusions of, oh, more people are living under the highway, is that because we developed a row team that's exclusively doing outreach under highways right now?
You should be an epidemiologist. Perfect question.
Yeah, we've struggled, all of this research that we're partnering with the UW about, we struggle with this chicken or the egg issue. Is like, okay, are we going to these places because people have a need there? Or are we going to these places because we're told to, or where are we going is because we're being told to go there, and so as we've moved away from the days of Brenda and Tom, where it was assertive outreach, we were really going to where we saw people living, and moving more towards where we're being told to go in many of our contracts. It's hard to say. I think it's one limitation we're just gonna have until we have more blanket, appropriately sized contracts throughout the city and the county that meet the needs of where we're serving, but we know that that won't happen. And I think a lot of what we've seen about the public complaint data reflects that, right? Is that we're going to where the complaints are, not always. So why is that? Why haven't we been asked to respond to Blue Ridge, right? So there's other factors at play here. Asia?
I mean, so I think you've pretty much covered my sentiments on it. You have to be really conservative with these kinds of data analyses. Oh, thanks, Dan. Yeah, you have to be really conservative about these data analyses because you want to patch up as many holes as possible so that when you're showing an analysis to people, there are very few limitations that really undermine the argument. And that's just good science, right? Like naming your limitations, but also choosing to do analyses in a way that are like strong arguments. So I think thinking about the way that data is collected and like the kinds of analyses you would like to see in the future, and then thinking about what kind of data would speak to that might be helpful. But like at the beginning of this project, Whitney provided us with encampment locations and then like several different kinds of counts of people at the locations. But it was complex. Like we couldn't use the people counts in the end to have a really reliable estimate of how many people were in each location over time, because the way that the data were gathered and then provided. So like if you want to do an analysis over time, you need encampment location over time, but you also need counts of people every time they've been seen over time. And we had big gaps where like, we know the encampment exists in 2016. We know that the same one, at least it's identified as the same one, exists in 2018, but we have no observation for 2017. So like, how do you like connect that? And I think this is an illustration. The reason I'm ranting about this is because we like, the way forward on this is thinking about data quality and like what kind of information can actually like make a decent argument to like speak to policymakers in the government such that you actually like achieve your goals. But like easier said than done, right? Like you're doing a great job. It's just like, what do you want to know next, right?
Well, on that note, yes. we really struggle with figuring out the balance of how much data collection and documentation is appropriate, specifically for this modality. But we are eager to find out what we can learn from what we have been able to provide. And so I wanted to thank you three for the initiative and partnering with us. And Amy, did you have some last words?
Yes, I would just invite those in the room, if you think about research questions that we should pursue, it would be great to hear from you. You know, you're the people who are closest to the data, so you have the best questions. And we'd love to hear what your questions are and see if we can find answers in the amazing database that you maintain.
Thank you, Amy. Well, thanks for hanging in there, everybody. And nice to see you all. And talk to you later.
Wait, there's a question from Amanda.
Oh, Amanda, is there qualitative research being done on how all this increased NIMBYism is impacting unhoused communities?
Yes, go read Chris Herring.
Chris Herring.
Chris Herring is like the go-to. There have been a couple dissertations out of the UW too that are kind of getting at this. Like, you probably want like ethnographies. There are studies out there, but I think we could put together a little list of a couple examples if you want to send them to Whitney, and then she can share.
I'd be
There-
happy to spread resources. Thank you, Asia. Yes,
There's
sir.
also some graduate students in sociology who are like actively looking at more typically kind of looking at changes in policing than like built environment. But definitely they're thinking about the built environment also. That works like ongoing and like now, but I would expect something in the next like year or so.
Awesome. Okay, take care, everyone.